Hello, this is Vaibhav Purandare, and the title of this video is, Has Russia always stood by India? The answer to that question is no, and I must proceed to explain why this is so. To find out, we must go back in time to the year 1962. Now that is the year in which China invaded India. In the middle of 1962, China suddenly started making minor incursions into Indian territory. In October 1962, there was a full-fledged assault on India's borders and China began invading India. Now the Indian government at that time, led by Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, had been warned by many of its ministers, its officials and well-wishers that China wanted to attack India. The army and the armed forces sent 7 letters at least to the Prime Minister saying that China was going to attack the country. And Pandit Nehru at that time said that China would never attack India till he was alive. Well, it so happened that in October 1961, China actually launched its attack. At that time, India was not very much in favor of the United States. It was not entirely in the Soviet bloc, but it leaned definitely towards the Soviet Union at that time. Pandit Nehru was the leader of the non-aligned movement, and India took a certain pride in being non-aligned at that point in time. But in times of difficulty, if China was going to attack us, who would we reach out to? Naturally, the first country we reached out to was Soviet Russia, the Soviet Union. It was much closer to India than America, which was said to be supporting Pakistan at that point in time. India had a long-standing relation with Russia, political, cultural, sporting, all kinds of relations. So obviously India looked up to Russia. Well, what was Russia's response? Russia said it was not going to be possible for it to support India. Russia and China were both communist nations. Russia, in fact, was part of the broader Soviet Union, and Nikita Khrushchev was the leader of the Soviet Union at that point in time. He told India, no, we cannot support India if China attacks. And China had at that point in time attacked. He also told India that if India decided to go to the United Nations against China, then the Soviet Union would support China at the United Nations. Now this created another kind of difficulty for India. The third point that the Soviet Union made through its journal, its official mouthpiece called Pravda, was that it rejected India's claim on the border. So the McMahon line, which India was claiming to be the border, was rubbished by the official Soviet mouthpiece. And they said that the border that the Chinese were claiming was the real border and not the one that India was claiming. Now this was the third point of difficulty. Firstly, Russia said we can't support you at all. If at all we support someone, it has got to be China. If we go to the United Nations, if India goes to the United Nations, the Soviet Union would support China. And the official Soviet mouthpiece also criticized India and India's conception of the India-China boundary. Now Chinese tanks and the Chinese armed forces entered India, invaded deep into India, and India actually was on the verge of defeat. So what does the government led by Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru do? Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru wrote 2 letters in quick succession in November 1962 when India was on the verge of defeat. Those letters were to the US President John F. Kennedy and B.K. Nehru, who was the Indian ambassador to the United States. B.K. Nehru was a cousin of Pandit Nehru. He carried those letters to the White House to President John F. Kennedy. And what did those letters say? Pandit Nehru, India's Prime Minister at that point in time, had written to John F. Kennedy that India was really in a desperate situation. And what was India seeking from the United States? The letter by the Indian Prime Minister stated that India wanted fighter jets from the United States. This was an open request made in a letter. Fighter jets. How many jets? 12 squadrons of supersonic flights, supersonic jets. Now, one squadron comprises more than 10 fighter planes. So, if you look at 12 squadrons, it's a lot of planes and fighter jets. Now, who would operate those jets? Obviously, not the Indian pilots, because they were not equipped to fly those jets. So the American pilots would come here and fly those jets against the Chinese army, against the Chinese forces. Plus, India wanted one more thing. They wanted some bomber jets also, some squadrons of bomber jets. And a third thing, India wanted radar communications. So India makes three specific demands to John F. Kennedy. One is for supersonic jets, the other is for bomber jets, and the third is for radar communications. What India was effectively doing then was to ask the US to be involved in a war against China on its behalf. So imagine India and the US versus China and the Soviet Union. Now this is something that we are never taught about in our school textbooks or in our university textbooks, and something we do not discuss at all. But there were two really desperate letters sent by Pandit Nehru, and our policy of non-alignment was tossed out of the window completely. So we were not really non-aligned at that point in time. We were asking the US to be part of India's war against China and to bomb China on India's behalf. And remember, this was the height of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union and the United States were going through a major Cuban Missile Crisis at that time. So the Cold War was at its height, and India was asking the United States to be part of its war against China and Soviet Russia. And Soviet Russia did not back up India at all. In the event, what happened was, suddenly on November 21, 1962, the Chinese withdrew their forces and announced a unilateral ceasefire because they had got the land they wanted. And India, as we know, later gave up much of its land to China, which China had conquered. And the war immediately came to an end. So the US did not send its airplanes, its fighter jets. But what the United States did send later in the following year were a set of radar communications which helped India during that period. What happened in 1963, soon after the war, is that John F. Kennedy was assassinated, as we know, in 1963, and then equations between India and the United States and Pakistan, and India and the Soviet Union changed completely. And then India was solidly with the Soviet bloc, and America sided with Pakistan openly. But 1962 is a very critical lesson for us, that the Soviet Union, whom we were very, very close to, did not back us at the time of our war against China, when China had attacked India. And also it's a pointer to how a government that famously called itself non-aligned had approached the United States, which actually it was pretending to look down upon, to fight its own war against China. Now, why are we talking about the 1962 war today? One is that we ought to remember that such a thing has happened. The second is there's plenty of talk in the wake of the 2022 war between China and Ukraine, Russia's attack on Ukraine, that India and Russia have always been together. Russia has always supported India. Russia will always be with India. The first point to remember, as we often talk today in this era about the fact that the Modi government is doing exactly what Pandit Nehru's government was doing, that it's being non-aligned by abstaining from voting against Russia at the United Nations, at the Security Council, at the Human Rights Council, and other various fora, is that firstly, India was never totally non-aligned, as we saw by the 1962 example. It was actually reaching out to the United States as against its ally, the Soviet Union. So Pandit Nehru's government was not totally non-aligned, and the government led by Narendra Modi is not totally non-aligned either. So India is not totally non-aligned. India looks after its own interests. Now cut to 2015 from 1962. Russia and Pakistan are having talks about having a joint military exercise in 2015 on Pakistani soil, and part of it in Gilgit-Baltistan. India registers its protest. India tells Russia it should not have any military exercises with Pakistan, and especially so in Gilgit-Baltistan, because Gilgit-Baltistan, India tells Russia and India tells Vladimir Putin, is part of Indian territory. What does Russia do in 2015? Russia goes ahead with its military exercise with Pakistan. This is the first military exercise that Russia has with Pakistan after the end of the Cold War. But importantly, it goes ahead despite India's protests. Of course, the fact is that Russia then excluded the exercises in Gilgit-Baltistan because they did not want to alienate India completely, but they went ahead with the exercise. So 1962-2015 are two standout examples of what happened. The reason for recounting these examples is that in international relations, and especially in conflict situations, things can be pretty dynamic and countries act according to their own self-interests. In 1962, we made the mistake of talking about the slogan Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai to the extent that we completely ignored the threat from China. And in 2022, when Russia and Ukraine have been at war and at conflict with each other, there are now echoes of India and Russia being brothers in arms all the time. The truth is that this is not a romantic relationship. This is not a sentimental kind of relationship. This is a pragmatic relationship. It's a deep relationship. India has deep defense ties with Russia, which it's going to maintain and has maintained for a long time, but its dependency on Russia has reduced. But it's time to end the romanticism about India-Russia relations and remember the 1962 episode where India is not non-aligned at all but approaches the United States for fighter jets against China and the Soviet Union. So we went back in history today to throw light on the present and what lies ahead in the future. It's a dynamic relationship. To cite a very fresh example that I have in mind, let me talk about the evacuation of Indian students from Ukraine in 2022. Now, there are a lot of critics of India's stand of abstention and saying that we ought to have voted against Russia, but Indian students were stuck in parts of Ukraine. And in a very significant development, when India was talking to Russian officials to allow for a safe corridor out of Ukraine for many Indian students, India had to deal with some of the most controversial officials, some of the most controversial elements in the Russian administration to get some of its students out. And India's neutrality or abstention allowed it to have that kind of communication with those controversial officials in Putin's team and to get their cooperation to get Indian students out of Ukraine, especially out of Sumy in Ukraine. So this is 1962, this is 2015, and here we are talking about 2022, where we have a dynamic situation where we better remember that our relationship or India's relationship with Russia is not a romantic one but a pragmatic one, and with the world order fast changing, we'll have to keep these examples of the past in mind even more when discussing India's future foreign policy. Thank you. If you like this video or found it useful, please do subscribe to my YouTube channel here. Thank you.